Today I want to share my thinking about a movement learning theory, accessing embodied imagination, that I developed through my doctoral research. The topics that I'll include are embodied knowledge, experiential learning, movement improvisation, bricolage, and reflection and reflective practice. These topics connect with 21st century learning skills, such as critical thinking and problem solving, communication, collaboration, and creativity and innovation. When I was thinking about a dissertation topic, I realized that my own areas of artistic and educational experience in dance, choreography, and movement improvisation are undervalued and under-theorized fields and knowledge domains. I was working within interdisciplinary studies, so I needed to weave together ideas from more than one discipline. To engage in interdisciplinary dynamic, one needs to know how complex phenomena and problems are approached from the multiple perspectives of different fields. I also considered multiple intelligences and ways of knowing or meaning-making that extend beyond traditional fields and knowledge domains inherited from how the institutionalized academy thinks of knowledge construction. I practice this without a microphone, so get a little less movement today. I'm going to talk about improvisation, but first want to talk about embodied knowledge and bricolage. As a dancer and choreographer, I understand that embodied knowledge is gained through experiential learning. You don't learn how to dance by reading books. You learn how to dance by dancing, observing movement, and studying dance and dancers. Martha Graham, just the same as the Dominican sandwich guy in the bodega across the street from my studio on the Lower East Side, know that dance is in the blood. When I went to Cuba in 2000 on a research project, I heard Cubans say that Cuba is dance. The extreme popularity of dance in Cuba emerges from the historic role of dance and movement in Afro-Cuban culture. One might also say that Cuba is bricolage. An example of bricolage is the Cuban dolls made from rags and bottle caps that I bought from a woman selling them from her living room window in Havana. Bricolage is improvisation, but it's also a way of life, living, and survival. Bricolage is folk creativity or using the materials at hand. Bricolage involves the creativity of alchemy, begetting gold from everyday stuff, or in the case of contemporary culture, making something useful from garbage. There was a time in the US when there was a greater collective willingness to tinker and fiddle to make something from trash. I grew up hearing stories of the Great Depression from my grandparents. People wouldn't throw away anything. They would save anything that might be of value. Rags were turned into rugs. In earlier times of hardship and famine, stories arose of stone soup. People began with stones as soup stock. With the addition of neighbors' contributions, they fashioned a broth that fed a neighborhood. There's a shamanic aspect to bricolage involving the human spirit and healing that comes when people engage in artistic and especially in improvisational creativity. Let's look at a DVD of an improvisation that I performed involving bricolage. I'm transforming objects used for other purposes by performing an improvisation with them as musical instrument, mask, and metaphor. Improvisation is by definition spontaneous and involves an opportunity to act. Improvisation is extemporaneous, on the spur of the moment and in real time. In terms of design or composition, it's creativity in the moment, without studied deliberation and without preparation. However, preparation, such as previous experience, formal study, or organizing one's workspace is part of many improvisational composers' approaches. Improvisation involves quickness, creativity in the moment. Spontaneity makes improvisation synonymous, if variable, with the creative process itself. Western and US culture's historic philosophical orientation is to start with thinking, followed by doing or not doing, depending on the outcome of the thought process. Put up your hand if you were raised to stop and think before doing something. Oh, I do see one or two hands up. Raise your other hand if you were taught to make an outline, plan, or blueprint before starting a project. Okay, and how many of you were taught other approaches to creativity and problem solving? Thank you. Oh, good to see you. A few less hands, though, I see. Despite improvisation's emphasis on spontaneity and quickness, plans can, of course, be part of the improvisational experience. However, improvisation has been called a retrospective rather than a blueprint way of achieving form. The improviser looks back retrospectively at what she has just created in order to shape in relation with what has happened. Improvisation is process-oriented. Trusting the process and maintaining the integrity of its properties are both a threshold to the improvisational experience and a challenging and often inaccessible path for individuals educated and only in traditional Western worldviews. Improvisation can be categorized as structured and free, which are categories appearing in the arts, performing arts, and organizational management literature as innovation and originality. Improvisation appears as structured, in other words, involving degrees of innovation or variation based on a prototype. Improvisation appears as free, or in other words, involving originality or creatio ex nihilo, creating out of nothing. Examples of those categories emerging from practice and situated on a continuum of purpose involving greater or less emphasis on the categories structured and free include structured, generative, and performative improvisation. Structured improvisation uses thematic materials or rules, including the rule that one can bend or break them. Examples include modern dance, jazz, and European clowning. Generative improvisation produces performance material in rehearsal that performers will replicate in performance, such as developing a theater script in experimental physical theater or a dance score for choreographed work. Performative improvisation comprises the process for rehearsal or performance using spontaneous live action, as in contact improv, in postmodern dance, or free jazz. The first DVD we saw involved performative improvisation. I spontaneously created the movement material while in live performance. Now let's take a look at an example of a structured improvisation that involves thematic material and rules. The improv was part of an hour-long work involving improvisational dance and music performed in Under the Radar by my dance company, and architect Evan Stoller's 40-foot diameter sculpture, Hudson Museum on the Ecliptic, and composer Judith Sanqua's music at the Birdcliff Arts Center in Woodstock. reason I developed a theory accessing embodied imagination was to broaden conceptualization of learning and thinking to include embodied learning and knowing. Embodied is defined as body-based, decentralized throughout the body, and emerging from the body. Embodied knowledge is misconceived and undervalued in Western and especially US culture as non-cognitive or non-thinking. And thank you, Phil, for that introduction. I also wanted to broaden conceptualization of creativity as an adaptive, fundamental, and accessible human characteristic. Broadening the concept of creativity through embodied imagination also expands the definitions of achievement beyond a small minority gifted in verbal linguistic and mathematical logical domains, as we have heard from other speakers today, to include creativity and genius accessed and demonstrated in other domains, including embodied ways of knowing. Accessing embodied imagination requires a non-logocentric or non-egocentric learning sequence that includes moving freely in three-dimensional space or improvising, then thinking about one's experiences through multimodal reflection. This isn't just moving, but it's moving followed by reflection. Multimodal reflection includes multiple intelligences, and some examples that you know well are multimodal reflection are speaking, writing, and creating visual arts, music, theater, dance, photo, and video responses to the movement improvisation experience. The reflection portion of the learning sequence includes savoring the experience through multimodal reflection and by verbalizing, naming the experience using descriptors and definitions, and interpreting the experience by any mode. Accessing embodied imagination reverses the relationship between cognition or thinking first and movement following. This reversal allows access to embodied knowing. There are benefits to all learners, and especially to those whose learning styles are nonverbal, nonlinear, experiential, and kinesthetic. Accessing embodied imagination is a theoretical means to broaden experiential learning through movement improvisation. In this last DVD, you'll see our colleagues from across New York State at last summer's ESP summer seminar in my creativity lab on creative movement and dance process. Their dances were developed from a process including generative improvisation. They created movement for performance in a process that included improvisation and rehearsal. So let's just take a couple of moments for reflection, please, about what we saw with each other's groups.
It seemed very balanced.
There's a lot of different energies and speeds, directions.
Yeah, I appreciate the architecture of it too, the way it was so architectural and just opened the space and closed, and the patterning was so formal. It felt like I was looking in Versailles. Let's combine groups.
Okay.
This time, think of patterning. If you're try to use something contrasting. So with that, whatever your pattern is that's emerging right now, see if you can contrast it or break it in some way. And ready, and we.
We'll be coming to the middle.
That's cool.
So think about if you're using all kind of very smooth energy, can you get some more staccato? So high, middle, low. Even if we punctuate down, see if we can move beyond the middle level into some other uses of the way we're thinking of ourselves off our feet, maybe, for example. Or quickness in the space, or so try to sort of split it apart a little bit, but fusing the two themes in some ways, right? You're mixing your dances, and you're looking for the way you can blow your patterns apart. Remember, you've got like the responder and the actor and then the audience. So each of you had been audience for each other, so maybe the public can help us reflect back what we think a pattern might have been. Where would you like the audience?
There, that's fine.
So let's just take a couple of moments for reflection, please, about what we saw with each other's groups.
It seemed very balanced.
There's a lot of different energies and speeds, directions.
I appreciate the architecture of it too, the way it was so architectural and just opened the space and closed, and the patterning was so formal. It felt like I was looking in Versailles. Achieving excellence in nonverbal, kinesthetic, and improvisational modes are fundamental to a holistic and humanistic education. This approach addresses social justice dimensions by providing greater access to those historically excluded by institutionally constrained focused on cognitive rationality. This movement learning theory challenges us not just to reach back into the arts, but to move forward into an increasingly complex world in which improvisational skills are highly appropriate, effective, and rewarding.